So VPA had reached out to me to look at one of the new broadheads. And in fact, at the time, I didn't know which broadhead it was. I just knew that it was a new one. VPA, of course, most people have probably heard of them. They've been around for a really long time and have been making good quality cut and contact broadheads in Indiana for years. So I said, sure, I'll go ahead and take a look at them. It ended up being this single bevel offering called the Omega. Now, this particular head is 200 grain right bevel. It is a 1 1/16 inch cutting diameter, no bleeders. The head profile itself has basically right past the tanto tip a nice angle of that ferrule that goes all the way back to meet the diameter of your arrow shaft. So it's a very streamlined profile, and what that also allows them to do, and they primarily did this for sharpening, is they cut the bevel and allowed that cut to basically go all the way up onto the ferrule itself. They did that on both sides, so it gives you a little bit more surface area to actually be able to lay the broadhead flat on a stone and be able to hold that angle by hand without the aid of a jig. And another thing that's a little bit unique is if I look on the back side of the bevel, only near the tip, there's a little bit of extra material that's left on there. You know, most of the blade itself is flat, like you would see with most single bevels, except that near the tip, there is a little bit of extra material there. Now, one of the reasons that they say they did that was because it added a lot of strength. And initially I was thinking, like, did they make the front of the head actually a double bevel and then single bevel it for the rest of the way? But when you look down the front of the head, it definitely still is asymmetrical, even with that extra material left in there. So you're definitely still going to get a rotational effect when that hits something hard. But we'll see if that makes it a challenge or not when it comes to sharpening, removing the back side of the burr. Because one of the huge marketing points of this head is that it's supposed to be way easier to sharpen than most single bevels. The first thing I did when I took these broadheads out of the package is I just tried shooting them to see how well they flew. And with my traditional bows, they're actually all mostly tuned for 125 or 150 grain heads, so I was getting consistent flight, but I was definitely showing a weak reaction. However, with my compound, which normally is only shooting 125 grain heads, I put these things on. Of course, that slowed my speed down to about 290, but I took a few shots, and at 40 yards I was hitting lower, but I did some slow motion footage just to see what the quality of the arrow flight looked like. And even at 290 feet a second, it still looked pretty good, even though I was probably a little bit underspined shooting this particular head. Now, it's worth noting that you wouldn't typically shoot a right bevel broadhead like this with left offset fletching, but that's all I had fletched up for my compound. So with that smaller cutting diameter of 1 1/16, I would imagine that most people are not going to have issues with getting this particular broadhead to fly, which with some two blade heads you definitely have to be aware of, because if you're shooting them at high speed especially, the longer ones and the wider ones can be a little bit more hard to control. And in fact, I did ask VPA in a follow-up question, are you guys planning on making a wider cut version of this or different sizes? And they are planning to make an 150 grain model, but they're not planning on making a wider cut model, which some people might be opposed to. But I can also say that from a flight perspective and a penetration standpoint, obviously the 1 1/16 inch is going to be beneficial in both of those regards, and that's kind of what they're going for with this particular head. The steel is also an S7 tool steel, which of course is really good at impact resistance, and it's hardened to a 56 to 57 Rockwell C. Now, that's not as hard as some broadheads on the market, but if you're used to shooting broadheads that are a little bit on the cheaper end of the spectrum, or you're newer to sharpening, be aware that that high of a hardness is going to probably require a little bit more effort in sharpening than you might be used to. Now, if they went to like a 60 Rockwell, then you would have even more time spent on the sharpening equipment. But this is kind of a nice, I don't know, I guess happy medium. I shouldn't say it's a happy medium, because usually you're choosing your hardness based on a proper match for whatever steel you're using, whatever the application is. But I find that something in the mid-50s, I usually don't have too much of an issue sharpening. Now, out of the box, the heads don't come super sharp. I would say they're probably not what I would prefer to bring in the woods from a hunting sharpness standpoint. I would definitely want to touch them up. Alright, I'm going to do a sharpness test here, and I'm going to start with the main part of that single bevel. .354. I'll go ahead and I'll try the front end of the broadhead, which has the reinforcement on the back side. So I'd expect this to be a little bit higher force. right, so almost 550, and you can just see it doesn't really bite nail at all. Some light shavings, but it's not digging in really. Definitely not shaving sharp. I know we can get this a lot sharper, so we'll see how easy it is to do with this geometry. Initial weight is 202.2 before sharpening. So I took some measurements before, and now I'm going to go ahead and see how easy these things are to sharpen. I got some diamond plates here, and then we'll measure the sharpness again. I'm starting with a 600 grit. This is what they recommended to start off with, just based off of whatever edge they put on with the factory, and then I'll go and work my way up from there. Now, you shouldn't really need to do this, but if you want to, it can be helpful to go ahead and just put the Sharpie marker on here just to make sure you're hitting the whole edge. One thing I did realize when I was initially doing this, I put the head flat on the plate and just took a few strokes, and I realized I wasn't applying as much pressure toward the nose of the head as I was the tail, and I could see that I was removing material, or the scratches were appearing a little bit more prevalently on the back of the broadhead. So then I figured out a way to hold it to just keep everything nice and equal in terms of the pressure. Yep, and I can notice again here too, doing the same thing, I put the Sharpie marker on, and there's actually still a little bit of Sharpie left toward the front of the broadhead, so I'm not applying as much pressure toward the nose as I am the rest of the head. So I tried to do some sharpening before, just kind of freehanding the broadhead, where I basically would lay the broadhead flat and then use a combination of 3 or 4 fingers to keep it as level as I could on the stone. And I got it fairly sharp. I tested it on my Sharpness Tester, and I was a little over 200 grams of force, which is sharp, don't get me wrong, but it's not as sharp as I think this steel is capable of. So I did some more digging, and I looked at some of the videos that VPA had produced about this head, and it showed them doing a method of holding this thing on the stone that was maybe a little bit more consistent than what I was trying. Because even though this thing has got a big flat spot, you can still put more pressure on one side than the other. So freehand sharpening like this always has a lot to do with how consistent you're able to hold that angle, hold that edge. The angle is very consistent because you're laying it flat on that big part of the bevel, but you need to make sure that the pressures are also consistent. Yeah, so far this method definitely feels easier to maintain a consistent front to back pressure and stay on that bevel. It's still not 100% totally easy to keep the pressure consistent. I can still feel it rocking this way a little bit, but side to side feels a lot better than I did before. So I've been going at this for a while, and I mean, I can feel a burr forming up on the front of the head, but still don't really have much on the back side. Could be a function of just the hardness of the steel. And it is upper 50s Rockwell. I mean, at this point, the blade is digging into the nail decently well. But I'll keep going a little bit further and see if I can't get a more obvious burr on the back part of the blade. And if I go any faster than that speed, I start to lose my positioning of the head. Like it'll start to lift or tilt front and back. So I definitely do need to still go somewhat slow to make sure I'm staying on the flat spot of that bevel. Alright, so now I will go to flatten the burr on the back side of the edge. Now I have to do this in 2 parts because the back of the blade isn't flat. It's got that thicker portion toward the front of the head. So I'll line this up so that I have just that flat spot on the diamond plate. And then I'll do a similar thing on the front, but I'm going to almost treat this kind of like it was a double bevel head by just trying to find that flat spot up in that edge and then just working it backwards. And I can tell too that by this point I've pretty much taken all of that black surface finish off of the front of that edge and taken off quite a bit of it off the flat spot on the back side of this blade as well. So now that I've finished with this 600 grit diamond plate, I'll flip it over, which happens to be a 1200 grit side. Normally I'd like to go to like a 800 or 1000 instead of that big of a jump, but this is what I've got to deal with this particular diamond plate. Okay, I'll go to the back side of the blade now. Yeah, it's catching on the nail pretty good now. I can't help but think that with the extra material that they left in here to add durability toward the front of the head, in doing so they made it a little bit harder to sharpen, which is kind of ironic, I think, just given that this broadhead is aimed at being easier to sharpen. The only reason I say that is because normally with a single bevel head, the back side of the blade is entirely flat. So like this motion that I just did here to break the burr off the back side of the blade, you'd be able to do that in the entire blade. But I have to do it in two separate motions, one that gets the back 2/3 of the blade, and then I have to find this angle up here to break the burr off of that part of the blade. It's not hard, but it is a little bit more time consuming. Yeah, it's starting to feel a lot sharper now. Now this last step here, I have a piece of paper. This is like cardboard paper, construction paper I guess you'd say, and this white rouge, and I just wipe some of that on there. A lot of times I actually like to do this last step with a bench grinder. I'll put those big paper wheels on it and I'll use this same stuff, and then I have that thing as kind of like a power strap where I can just wipe the blade across the top in a couple passes and it's like a mirror polish. But I'll just do it here by hand. As always, this part feels pretty smooth, and you can see as this white material starts to turn dark, a little bit of that material that's being left behind. And then I'll go ahead and get the back side of the blade. Okay, I'll just wipe some of that off with my shirt, some of the extra residue. Definitely is sharp against the nail. I still wouldn't say that it easily shaves. I am getting a couple hairs to pop. Let's go ahead and give it another test on the sharpness tester here. Now, it's worth noting that I do not claim to be a great freehand sharpener. I can do all right if I have sharpening jigs or if I use power tools, again, that have kind of a guided angle. .171. .177, consistent at least. .161. All right, so we got a 3 test average. And let's test the front of the head. .401. .3 82. 461. Now note that this thicker part of the edge, I mean, it is a little bit harder to sharpen, like I mentioned, because you have to kind of freehand the backside of that bevel, which isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. So I may have very well screwed this up. I may have even had it sharper at some point during the sharpening process and then messed it up toward the end, because this number still isn't all that sharp. And I haven't even really dealt with the tanto tip, which I think a lot of guys generally will just take like a file or something like this and just hit that to give it a little bit of bite. All right, I wanted to make sure I gave this head a fair shake and wasn't limiting the performance based on my hand sharpening skills. So I broke out my worksharp precision adjust, which is a fixed angle sharpener, and we'll see if we can't get it any sharper. Now this feels sharp. Let's just see out of curiosity. Yeah, look at that, just easily shaved. $85. $96. $150. $89. Now let's test the front part of the edge. $302. $342. $348. Let's see if that front part Yeah, I did pop a couple hairs with this front part, but it's definitely not as sharp as this blade back here, which is just like wiping hair off sharp. And one thing I did notice too, I'll point this out, is that when I had done my initial hand sharpening, and then I went back again and did the worksharp, I noticed that when I set the angle, I was able to get this flat pretty well, but right at that very little edge, it took me a while to actually get the metal back down to that area. So what that tells me is when I was hand sharpening, I was probably lifting off a little bit too much, even though it didn't feel like it. So anyways, you can see what it looks like now. And this was just working through 320 grit, then 400, 600, 800 ceramic, and then a couple strokes with the strop. One other thing I'll note about these little testing machines, this one was the PT50A, the best certified machines that you see a lot on YouTube. I've found that there can be a lot of variability, even when you're testing the same head. Now that could be because you had variation in how you sharpen the head, where you had sharp spots and dull spots, chips, that sort of thing, but it also is just some natural variation in the test method, where I can push down at about the same spot and get a few different readings. So I usually like to take at least 3 individual readings and average them out. And in addition, I've also found that on some heads, like single bevels especially, if you push them at a certain angle and then you tilt it just based on where that wedge is coming in, you know, if you're trying to push in like this or push in like that, or basically have it centered, that can affect your readings as well, just based on how much that little cord that you're testing is stretching or not. So all that to say, it is an interesting data point. It's something you can get numbers from. It's not the end all be all. I usually like to use a couple different methods, you know, such as like the shaving or how well does it bite nail, the numbers here, or testing with paper just to see how cleanly it cuts. And even that can sometimes be challenging with a broadhead that's so thick. I mean, it works well with knives because your knives are generally not that thick, so you can just, you know, slice right through the paper. But sometimes With a broadhead, you start to test and then your ferrule kind of gets in the way and it makes it sort of awkward. But a lot of times in the field, if I want to know if my head is sharp or not, just touching it against my nail at different angles, if it's sharp, really sharp, it'll just stick and bite at just about any angle that I hit it against my nail. And that's sort of how I know, yep, this is still looking pretty good, or maybe this head needs a touch up. Weight after sharpening. So lost about 1 grain sharpening both sides. So now just a little bit of commentary about broadhead styles, single bevels, double bevels, multi-blade heads. I have a couple of other single bevels that I've used in the past, and I guess one thing that I do like about this one, like I mentioned earlier, is that from a flight standpoint, these are both 200 grain heads. You can tell which one's going to fly a little bit more forgiving. You might be able to get it to both fly well, but if you push them to the limit, this head being slightly shorter and a little bit less cutting diameter and just less overall surface area is going to fly better. Now, compare it to an even smaller head, and I would say this one would probably fly better in that regard. The faster your bow speed is, the more that's going to come into play, or if you are on the edge of your tune, or if you're not using enough fletching. And also when it comes to single bevels specifically, you know, they're intended to be able to apply that rotational effect and sort of pop their way through bone. And because of that, they'll oftentimes have that tanto tip to help give it a little bit of extra durability. And in some heads, you won't see a tanto at all. You'll just see kind of like a wedge tip where they just have the single bevel going off one side, the other bevel going off the other side, and it just creates like a nice flat point, which I always find is, you know, that wedge tip doesn't seem to breach hide very easily. You know, we used to do testing when we would have a deer down, and we would just take a bunch of different styles of heads and just see how much force anecdotally it took to push through the hide. And always the cut on contact style tips, like this 3-blade one, or like here's a, you know, day 6 2-blade style, or like the iron will, not as much their single bevel one, which this one is, but the double bevel ones, those heads would push through with the least amount of effort. The heads that were single bevel that had the tanto style tip took more effort to push through. It was like all the cut on contacts were kind of like at this level of force, and then we had some chisel tip style of heads that were, you know, maybe replaceable blade broadheads. Some of them were way more force to be able to push through the hide, just depending on how sharp they were. And then the tanto style tips were maybe a little bit above the cut on contacts, enough to where you could definitely tell it was a different tier, but not so much that you couldn't push it through without too much effort. So it's kind of one of those trade-off decisions, right? If you're using a single bevel because you think you might hit bone and you want that extra strength and that rotation, then the tanto tip is probably a worthwhile trade-off. If you're like, well, I'm never hitting bone anyway, a cut on contact style of tip is usually going to breach the hide and cut soft tissue with a little bit less force. It may or may not end up making much of a difference, just depending on what kind of a setup you're shooting and what you end up hitting. So in summary, what do I think about this broadhead just based off of what I have tested, which is flight characteristics and sharpening ability, and what I happen to know just about the steel itself with other heads that I've used? S7 with a good heat treat is a very durable steel option, probably one of the best durability options for a broadhead. So I don't have any issues with the toughness of this head at all, even though that's not something that I directly tested. I've tested a number of other S7 heads in the past, and they're generally above and beyond what you would deem necessary for a broadhead. Sharpness out of the box, in my opinion, wasn't that great. I mean, you probably could use it right out of the box to hunt with, but it didn't really bite nail all that well. It definitely wasn't shaving sharp out of the package, so I would certainly want to touch it up prior to going hunting with it. And as far as the sharpening ability, which was one of the key things that this head was trying to market towards, I think they did a good job by making it a really nice big flat bevel to be able to hold that angle from a sharpening jig free standpoint. However, I do think they made it a little bit more challenging by leaving that additional material toward the front end of the head, meaning that you had to take off the back side of the bevel with a couple different angles that you had to try and match, instead of just leaving the back side of that bevel flat. I think they did that to help increase the toughness of the head, but with S7, I think they would have been just fine leaving it as is. The tanto tips are, of course, a little bit more difficult to sharpen as well because you have additional angles there to worry about. Granted, it's such a small little portion of the head. I'm more worried about the sharpness generally of the rest of the broadhead itself, and I was able to get the back side of this broadhead very sharp. 170 or so on this best tester is very, very sharp. For me, that's about the edge of where it starts to shave. Just with my hair coarseness, I got to get like a 150 or so before it really starts to pop off. And if I can get it under 100, then it's like face shaving for me. But I still think that if you're sharpening challenged, using either jigs in conjunction with this head or any other head is definitely going to be a good option to go with. And if you're really concerned with the ability to be able to sharpen a broadhead without any kind of jigs or fixtures and be able to do it basically anywhere out in the field, then it's really hard, in my opinion, to beat something like this 3-blade design. This also happens to be a VPA head, machined one piece. The beauty with a head like that is you can even use something like this file and be able to work with that file, and I can get a head from, have it pretty much dull, and using a file can get it to a nice toothy edge, really easily biting the nail, and even borderline shaving in a couple of minutes. And if I want to polish that edge up even more, you can of course lay it flat on diamond stones and work down through the progressively lower grits and eventually finish on the strop. But I do still think it's a good option. It's a little bit on the expensive side, but again, the machining geometries I think help to determine that, along with the steel of course, that this ends up being one of those broadheads that's just priced in that upper tier that we've kind of gotten used to in that, $100 to $130 range per pack of 3. So if you have any additional questions, please leave them in the comment section down below, and thanks for watching.